This is the last part of chapter 14 and 17. So we've kind of covered this already in evidence for evolution, but we're going to go over it again because there's some things that you need to know. Biogeography, that's where things are in terms of biological organisms. And why are organisms found where they are? That's the question it answers. How do they get there? And then types of distributions. This is Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a generation younger than Darwin, who came up with the same idea of evolution by natural selection and descent from a common ancestor. He was not as rich as Darwin. He came from a poor family, but he was a collector for people like Darwin. And he spent a lot of time first in South America and then in Southeast Asia. And this is where he came up with evolution by natural selection. And in fact, there's a place, Wallace Line, that is associated with him because he noticed that in Southeast Asia there's something called the Wallace Line now, and it separates whether it's actually this or that, or maybe even the Weber line. There's some dispute over that. But anyway, this line separates organisms that are found mainly from Southeast Asia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia, up into Thailand, Vietnam, that sort of stuff. And then Australasia, which includes, let's see, everything, including New Guinea, and then Australia, and some other, like things like the Solomon Islands, which are out here. Okay, and the main thing is that we can actually see that in terms of so here's Wallace's line. So on this side, these are animals, but also plants and birds and things like that. We see honey gliders, orangutans, batang buffaloes, let's see, rhinoceros, and Asian elephant, things like that, tiger, and then on the other side, we see only marsupials in terms of mammals. Well, not only marsupials, also here's a monotreme. That's an Echidna spinianator, which is an egg-laying mammal. These are all marsupials, these mammals here. And then some birds like birds of paradise. Okay, and there's a really kind of distinct line, and the same thing with different species of plants and fungi and other organisms. Okay, so how did it get like that? So we're going to talk mainly about historical biogeography. And then we'll talk more about ecology later on when we start the ecology section, which will be next. Okay, so historical biogeography, past processes that influence the current distribution of taxa at whatever taxonomic level. So geographic clustering of similar forms represent ancestor-descendant relationships, right? So these are some birds that are all related to each other, and they have a distribution across South America in specific places. And that's partly the result of, well, first there was an ancestor there, and then there was speciation events because of vicariance, various geographical isolation factors. Okay? So, again, in this case, for these birds, I think the taxa actually originated there. I don't think they dispersed there. Also, vicariance. There's also some that probably went extinct as well. And then ecological revolves around contemporary processes that explain current distribution. Ecological tolerance of limits that species distribution, like abiotic factors like temperature, the amount of rainfall, precipitation, if you're in the water, pH of the water, saltiness of the water, depth of the water, if you are on land, elevation, all kinds of different things. Okay? And so those are abiotic. Abiotic means without biology. And then there's biotic interactions, in other words, like we went over, coevolution and things like that. Okay. So, one of the main reasons that we find certain organisms in certain places is because of vicariance on a very large scale in terms of continental drift. Okay? And so this is Gondwana land, which was the southern part of Pangaea, and it didn't start really breaking up until, I think, 200 million years ago or so. And it broke up kind of. There was eastern breakup that included Africa, India, Australia, and then western, which included South America, Antarctica. South America and Australia and South America, Antarctica and South America were kind of all lumped together. But anyway, you can see that if you had some organism, if this was a whole continent, right, all stuck together, you could see how if you had an origin from speciation, how that organism, if it was successful, could spread all over, and then as the continents started to drift apart, there'd be separation and then changes because of different evolutionary trajectories. So, for example, we'll look at this, but on the bottom, here's Pangaea, Laurasia, and then the southern part, which is up here. This is Gondwana land. And then you can start to see what kind of broke up first. Until finally we get a situation where it's more along the lines of and then, so there's these ratite birds as an example, including rhea in South America, also another bird, lesser and greater tinamous that are related. Africa, there's a couple of different species of ostrich, a couple of different species of cassowary in New Guinea, emu in Australia, kiwi in New Zealand, and some other birds in New Zealand that were called moas that went extinct once the first Maori humans arrived and hunting them all to extinction. They were all flightless birds except for the tinamous in South America. So there's some question whether their distribution is just because of vicariance or if, in fact, if there was some dispersal going on at that time. Okay, so I'm going to want you to watch, let's see here. This paleogeography, and it shows how the breakup from the late Proterozoic 600 million years ago until the present. And in terms of how the continents drifted apart and why they're in the configuration they are. And then we can go from there as far as why we have certain species in certain places. Okay, so nowadays we have these faunal realms. We have the whole Arctic, which includes the near Arctic. No, come on. The near Arctic and the Paleoarctic. And the Paleoarctic is like that. And the near Arctic is like that. But at one point, they share a lot of the same fauna. So it's the whole Arctic. In terms of Central and South America, there's the Neotropical of Latin America. And includes a lot of things that some of which actually get up to North America, and it was all because of the great Panamanian Isthmus interchange that happened. There's also the West Indians islands, so the Caribbean have many different species that are found, and then the lower part of South America is called the Argentinian, which is also part of Latin America. And then the Afro-Tethyan includes this and includes the Mediterranean, Ethiopian, Oriental, and then finally we've got we'll say Australia, Madagascar, that have distinct faunas, floras and faunas. Okay, so this is what we find today, and a lot of the reason we find certain things in certain locations is because of history. Obviously, very old history, hundreds of millions of years, and then also current conditions and current processes. So dispersal, one of the great, so there's different kinds of dispersal. Obviously, seed dispersal for plants, or pollen dispersal, or animals dispersing from one place to another, plants managing to get from one place to another, let's say drifting. Coconuts are a good example of seed dispersal by ocean, water, things like that. A lot of seed dispersal by animals, including bats, birds, and primates. And then some great large-scale regional dispersal. This is called the Great American Interchange, and it happened because the Isthmus of Panama connected North America and South America. So there were a bunch of species from South America And these are all related to each other. They're called xenarthans. And they include anteaters. They include armadillos. They include tree sloths and ground sloths, porcupine family, and this is opossum, also some marsupials, and then there's also some other rodents that are found only in South America, and these moved north into North America. And then in North America, there was elephants, peccaries, camels, cat family, wolves, bears, zebras, all kinds of different things, pigs, all that. And a lot of them moved down into South America, okay, where some of them still are. The thing is, it was an asymmetrical interchange because it looks like the xenarthans were a bit more primitive. So about the only thing that actually is in North America now from South America are armadillos. But at one point there were giant ground sloths. There might have been some anteaters, things like that. There was a porcupine that we still have the descendant of. But the North American species that moved into South America were much more successful. And so now in South America, of course, the elephants are gone from North America and South America. But bears, there's a spectacled bear in South America. There are the pig family, including peccaries, the camels, including alpacas and things like that in South America. There's also a lot of different species of canids and cat family. And then there's peccaries, no giraffes anymore, but there's peccaries down there. And there's no there's no zebras, but there's now not peccaries, tapirs in South America down here. But all these things like this is extinct. This is extinct. Camels are extinct, except they're down here, and all that. So there was this is all dispersal made possible by the Isthmus of Panama. Okay. So what causes the origination and diversification of new taxa? In other words, how do new taxa originate and how do they diversify? Well, we know a little bit about diversification. First of all, origination, we know that all taxa are descended from common ancestors. So origination means that an ancestor was in a certain location, that individual that species got there either by dispersal or was already there, a more distant ancestor. And then diversification, of course, we have speciation. Now, new forms or taxa, species, let's say, originate continuously. They don't all survive very well or for very long. Because there's lots of competition among other processes like predation and things like that, an species that is in the same location for a while becomes a niche resident, and they become adapted to that specific location with all the ecological factors that make it successful. So it's hard to unseat or a species that's already very successful in a certain place. So their taxa are more abundant and their adaptations are more fine-tuned than any newcomers. Now, occasionally a newcomer can come in, but then that requires competitive displacement. That means getting rid of the previous tenant or forcing that tenant to start using other resources. The evolutionary potential for new taxa is more easily realized when they can access vacant niches. So, what would happen if there was no niche resident in a certain location? And how might this happen? Well, after mass extinctions, let's say the extinctions that got rid of the dinosaurs, that provided lots of opportunities after diversity started to first it was very depressed, and then a lot of the things that survived started to diversify very rapidly. And so, like mammals, became much more diverse. Birds are dinosaurs, but only those avian dinosaurs actually survived the end Cretaceous mass extinction, and then they radiated it into over 10,000 species. And then there might be other reasons, like because of ecological opportunity. For example, colonizing new locations like islands or lakes or things like that that weren't there before. Or finally, innovation of phenotype and novelty that allows organisms to occupy niches that weren't there before. For example, like non-avian or avian-like dinosaurs, kind of bird-like dinosaurs that could actually fly, led to eventually to birds. Being able to fly allowed a whole range of habitats and lifestyles to occur. So look at those. So, extinction and speciation. Think back to the analogy of the birth of offspring and speciation. So, here's your grandparents. They give rise to your mom and dad. They also gave rise to you aunts and uncles. And then you and your offspring and your siblings, and then your cousins. Okay? So, and then previous to your great-grandparents and so on. So if you go back far enough, you get to very early, modern humans. And these give rise to different lineages, right? Different families. Okay. And so that's the same thing with speciation, right? Lineages originate sometime back in time, and then they diversify. And now we have like sharks and rays. Those are still around. Also, right in the middle of all this, there were some taxa that went extinct all along the way. Okay? Another lineage of bony fish. Origination and a whole bunch of species that went extinct. And then some lineages like this dinosaurs right here, one group of dinosaurs, and then another group of dinosaurs, theropods, and okay, and they went extinct. So that's like death. Grandma and grandpa. Some of you have lost grandparents or even parents and uncles and all that. Okay. Same thing happens to taxa. Some once they come into existence, new species, new taxa, because of isolation and reproductive isolation and all that, speciation occurs. And then some manage to hang on, some go extinct. Trilobites have originated 530 million years ago and then went extinct 252 million years ago during a mass extinction. Okay. So mass extinctions reshape the biota. And how do extinctions do that? Well, they clear the decks. In other words, just think about what happens if an asteroid struck, like it did in the Caribbean, the Yucatan Peninsula. A whole bunch of species, almost 75% of species and families of all kinds of organisms, plants, fungi, animals, everything went extinct. Okay, all those things were wiped out, and they go extinct in terms of extinctions, irrespective of previous success. So the trilobites arose during the Cambrian explosion and lasted almost 270 million years until a mass extinction, the Permian mass extinction. 252 million years ago, they vanished entirely. So some very successful clades vanished forever. Non-avian dinosaurs, another example, showed up perhaps around 243 million years ago after the end Permian mass extinction. Finally, there was some diversification in terms of reptiles, and then the dinosaurs arose out of that, and they lasted all the way until 60 million years ago when there was the end Cretaceous mass extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs. And so they were around for 177 million years in terms of the fossil record. And then multituberculate mammals were the most successful mammals, and yet they went extinct 30 million years ago, around there, and they were around for 160 million years or so. So you can imagine a mass extinction causes a complete change in all the living things that are on planet. Whether taxa survive or don't is usually just a matter of chance, though might be species level things, like things that are very widespread all around the planet. In certain small locations, they might have refuges where they actually manage to hang on. Okay, so it looks like the birds, which are a group of dinosaurs, right? Theropod dinosaurs. One group actually managed to survive that mass extinction and are now modern birds today. So there's usually very low biodiversity after everything gets wiped out. As the biota recovers and diversification and speciation start to occur, there are remarkable ecological opportunities for the survivors. Just think, before there was competition with similar species for food sources and things like that. Well, if all your competition has been wiped out and you've managed to survive and hang on after that mass extinction, the opportunities are limitless, and you often get extreme rapid speciation and diversification. So, some previously marginal taxa flourish and become major clades. In other words, like adapt, and this is called when lots and lots of new species and new groups that are descended from old groups have an opportunity to speciate a lot of them in a very short period of time. This is called an adaptive radiation. Okay? That's very important to understand. That's one of the outcomes that can happen. And so mammals, which were around during the time of the dinosaurs, all the way back into the Jurassic, but they were not very abundant and not very diverse. When the dinosaurs all died out, mammals exploded and became a dominant player around the world, as did modern birds. Okay. So there have been 5 mass extinctions since the beginning of the Paleozoic. So most of geological time was in the Proterozoic, and there were very few organisms that were multicellular. Okay, but there were some at the very end. But then, finally, during 11% of geological time, is the Phaerozoic eon that includes all the way from 540 million years ago until the present. And there were these following mass extinctions. There was one at the end of the Ordovician, 440 million years ago. Another one at the end of Devonian. One of the biggest ones was during the Permian mass extinction, where over 90% of all species went extinct. It took about 12 million years for it to all happen, and then another 20 million years or so to start to recover. And then at the end of the Jurassic, which is in the Mesozoic, let's see. Permian. Here we go. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. And then finally, the end Cretaceous max that ended the Mesozoic and was the start of the, what is it called? The Tertiary and Quaternary. $65 million years ago. Now, in the meantime, as you can see, there's been other mass extinctions and times where there's very little extinction. And there's, in ecological time, not evolutionary time, there's something called background extinction, where things are have originated and then they go extinct because of ecological sources or something else. But it's kind of like they're always being replaced by the origination of new taxa. But mass extinctions really reshape the biota. So, end Permian extinction was the largest. 90% of species lost. Trilobites perished after surviving from the Cambrian. All the way to the end Permian. And then they went extinct, even though they were one of the most successful taxa of all time. And when that happens, when there's a mass extinction like that, it kind of partially resets the evolutionary clock. New taxa have a chance to originate, kind of going back in time when there wasn't as much competition. So, do mass extinctions have a major impact on the forms of biodiversity that exist later, or are they just temporary reductions? And we know from a fact that they have very large effects. In fact, they often lead to the adaptive radiation of many, many new taxa in a short period of time. So, what extinction occurred 200 million years ago? The Triassic extinction, right here. Okay. What animal groups were most affected by the Triassic event? Reptiles, which finally gave rise to the dinosaurs. Let's see. Okay, so these are some of the mass extinctions. There's been other ones as well, and we might be undergoing one right now. Okay, so one of the most famous, of course, is the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. For a long time, it was thought that the dinosaurs were probably wiped out because of lots of volcanism, like the Deccan Traps in India. Was a massive eruptions that went on for hundreds of thousands of years, spewed large amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and other things. And it was thought that maybe that was the reasons the dinosaurs went extinct. But then two people, a father and son, Alvarez's at UC Berkeley, one was a physicist, and an astrophysicist, and the other one was a geologist. They noticed that in a certain layer of rock, around 66 million years ago, a very thin layer was a spike of an element called iridium. Iridium is not common on Earth normally, but a lot of asteroids have iridium. And they suggested that perhaps there was an asteroid strike, and that strike, as the asteroid was pulverized, all this iridium was released, and it rained down upon the Earth over a short period of time, perhaps 10 years, 100 years, whatever. Very thin layer, maybe even less than that. And also in this layer, there was evidence of a great impact. There's these things called shock quartz and microtectites. And these are formed when, let's say, soil is impacted and heated up to a great temperature, and it all turns to glass. Okay, and so there was also a spike in that same layer with the iridium, and it suggested that there had been an asteroid impact. And so the hunt was on. A lot of people doubted this was what actually happened, but finally, in the early, I guess it was the early 80s, some geologists doing sampling for oil and stuff like that came across these peak ring and what looked like to be a very old impact. It's causing, a huge crater right off the coast of Yucatan, right here. And that was 120 miles across. All this stuff was ejected up into the atmosphere. Iridium showed this very strong peak at a certain time period. So this is iridium levels way down here. And it went all the way up to over 3,000. Okay? And this is sharp quartz and microtectites from the impact. And the asteroid impact splashed material from here, forming the crater and all across the Caribbean, and caused a huge tsunami. That went all the way up into what is the present day United States. The thing is at this time, there wasn't one North American continent. There was actually an inland sea that went all the way up into Canada. Okay, and so there's evidence that it affected that all the way up there as well. And then following that, there was a global IR pulse. In other words, IR is infrared radiation or heat, and molten microtectites rained down and started fires all over the earth, and burned up much of the vegetation and killed most of the animals on land and in the ocean. The ocean became very toxic, very acidic, and was probably, and this was probably the reason for the loss of all these species. And there's this formation that's found in North America, up in Montana, North Dakota, and so on, and it spans from about 76 million years to about 60 million years. In other words, it spans, it's the layers that include after the mass extinction. And recently there were some deposits. It looks like the impact created what was in effect massive earthquakes all over the world. So the biggest earthquakes we've had recently were like 9s and 9.2s, which were absolutely humongous, like Japan and all that. It's theorized it was up to like 11.5 or 12 on the Richter scale, which would mean that any water body probably was sloshed all over the place. And so here we've got a fossil bed from these freshwater fish and other organisms, and also turtles, and then also there's been some terrestrial dinosaurs found in the mix. Okay, so the extinction that wiped out the dinosaurs allowed the mammals, after a couple of million years, once things started to kind of come back, allowed the mammals to diversify. But there were different kinds of mammals in different places. So in Australia and New Guinea and some islands around there, there were only marsupials. In the rest of the world, there were all kinds of different things, but mostly placental mammals. There's some in South America that were marsupials too. But anyway, there was diversification of all these mammals because they were no longer being eaten and competed by dinosaurs and things like that. So you see, an adaptive radiation starting around 60 million years ago in some places in terms of mammals. In Australia, they had everything from large herbivorous marsupials, kind of like cattle and things like that, to large predators like this Tasmanian wolf, right? But this is a marsupial. The gray wolf that we found across North America and Asia is a placental mammal. This is examples of convergent evolution, again, where you find the same sorts of adaptations because the environment favors those adaptations, not because of descent from a common ancestor. These two species do not share a common ancestor, but they share a similar lifestyle. In other words, they're predators. The same thing happened with all these other kinds of similar things. Koalas are marsupials, and sloths tree sloths that are found in South America, and at one time in North America too. Anteaters found in South America and North America, similar to the numbat. Again, convergent evolution. Small mesopredators like kitty cats and various kitty cats, or rodents like squirrels versus this marsupial, or bandicoots and rabbits. These all are examples of convergent evolution, and after the mass extinction, mammals radiated into all these different species. There's some 5,000 or 6,000 today. The same thing happened with birds. Of course, birds are dinosaurs, but they're the only lineage that actually survived. And they went from probably very few species that survived the mass extinction to more than 10,000 today. Same thing happened. Now, you can also have adaptive radiation when it's colonization of new habitats. A good example of this is the Hawaiian Islands. When the Hawaiian Islands, one island at a time, of volcanic in origin, they rise above the surface of the water. There's nothing living on them, but anything that manages to get there after it's cooled down and some erosion has happened, perhaps can start living there. And if they can survive long enough, they can actually have kind of a wide open, no competition. And if there's differences in habitat type throughout the islands, like there are because of elevational differences and dry parts and wet parts and all that, you can get an adaptive radiation. So these silver swords, there's about 32 of them. They are actually related to a species, a bunch of species that are found on the west coast that are very similar. They're called tarweeds. They're basically little like dandelions. They all look about the same thing. But somehow the ancestors of the silver swords, some tarweeds, somehow made it to Hawaii. Whether there was a big storm and they floated on a log over and somehow landed on, let's say, Kauai or something like that. Eventually, this gave rise to over 32 different species, and Hawaii has very many different habitats. They have lava fields, more lava fields, and great big dense forests. And so you now have silver swords that have radiated into 32 different species. The same thing happened with ecological opportunity with other things that made it to Hawaiian Islands, including Hawaiian honey creepers, crickets, moths, Drosophila, right? And the Silver Sword Alliance. Okay. So there's all these niches that weren't there before, or opportunities to create new niches. And then you get a big radiation from usually just a single species, male and female, that somehow get there in the first place. And you can see also in terms of when things happen. So the first, besides Midway, the first island to show up was Kauai. And so things landed on Kauai first. Some of those things then dispersed to the Big Island. and other things managed to get to Oahu, that then went back to Kauai, for the Molokai group, back to Kauai, from Kauai over to Maui, from this area all the way over to the Big Island. So things went back and forth, dispersing, and this gave, as the new islands came up, and this gave new opportunities. Each new island created new habitat. I do want to point out. Another good example is the cichlid fish radiation of over 500 species in the Rift Valley lakes in East Africa, Victoria, Malawi Lake, a number of other lakes. And these lakes didn't exist, and then there was a big floods, and some fish, some managed to get washed in the floods, and they started a lineage of fish called the cichlid fish of East Africa, and these radiated into many, many, many different species. So a lake is basically like an island, but it's an island of water. Then finally, another thing that can lead to adaptive radiation besides colonization, one other thing. Key innovations. Sometimes the evolution of new phenotype, new adaptation, leads to further diversification. So a perfect example of that is we see that feathers initially evolved in dinosaurs. Okay, here are early dinosaurs. They're covered in feathers. Probably they have body feathers with pigments that have been recovered from fossils, as well as other evidence of downy feathers. They probably displayed things like that. These things couldn't fly. They were bipedal like modern birds. And then feathers eventually were already on bird-like dinosaurs, and the feathers started to change. And they went from symmetrical feathers to asymmetrical feathers. That's not very good. Asymmetrical feathers, and we can see that here. Okay, and they actually, asymmetrical feathers actually create lift, and so they evolved. They were an innovation that resulted in flight. And flight allowed birds to occupy new niches that were not there beforehand at all. This is actually called something, not an adaptation, but an exaptation. Taking like a vestigial trait, in this case something that's used for one function, feathers for insulation and display, and a new function arose with some modifications, namely flight feathers. So this is a bird-like dinosaur that could fly. I forget which one is Archaeornis or something like that. Same thing happened with the evolution of jaws in early vertebrates. Early vertebrates didn't have jaws. With the evolution of jaws, these early vertebrate fish kind of ancestors were able to eat things and crush things that they couldn't beforehand. So these kinds of things then lead to another adaptive radiation. So birds, there's now 10,000 species of birds. There's all these different kinds of fish, major clades, minor clades that all had jaws, all vertebrates that had jaws descended from an ancestor that it didn't. And I'm going to also add some a quiz question here. Thanks.